They said the forest was quiet that morning, but if you listened closely beneath the rustling leaves beyond the chirping birds, you'd hear something else. A heartbeat. Not just one. A wounded golden retriever pup, no older than 5 months, curled protectively around a dying rabbit. She was bleeding. But she didn't move. Not for herself. For the fragile thing still breathing beneath her chest. And from the edge of the woods, a broken man stood frozen. Because in that moment, he wasn't looking at a dog. He was looking at a reason to try again. Chapter 1. Light Between the Pines. The first frost of October clung to the ferns lining the forest floor near Black Elk Hollow, a quiet, fog-laced valley tucked in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. The air held the crisp bite of a morning that hadn't quite decided whether it wanted to rain or remain still. The scent of damp pine and old bark lingered under the mist. It was here on the edge of a forgotten trail where leaves blanketed the ground like faded pages that Caleb Foster stopped short. Caleb, 38, was a man built by loss and solitude. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a once athletic frame softened by years of silence and grief. His beard, the color of dark chestnuts, was unkempt, and his hair, graying too early, was pulled into a loose tie at the nape of his neck. His green flannel shirt hung loose on his frame, and the heavy boots he wore were speckled with old paint and clay from repairing the porch on his cabin. A former veterinarian, Caleb had retreated to this quiet town after losing his wife and daughter in a car accident 2 years ago. Since then, he had spoken more to trees than people. He wasn't unkind, just unreachable like a radio signal lost in the mountains. He had only ventured out this morning to investigate reports of a broken fence and a few raccoons rifling through compost bins along the trail. But what he found instead was something entirely different. Curled at the base of a fallen log was a puppy no more than 4 or 5 months old, with golden fur streaked in mud and bits of pine needles clinging to her legs. One ear drooped forward, while the other stood uncertainly, like it couldn't decide which way the wind was blowing. Her chest rose and fell quickly, as if every breath required negotiation. But that wasn't what made Caleb stop. Beneath the puppy's chest, pressed tightly into the curve of her belly, was a small wild rabbit, its fur matted with blood. Its hind legs splayed at an unnatural angle. The animal was breathing barely. The pup clearly injured herself with a shallow cut across her front paw, trembled, but made no sound. Her wide amber eyes locked onto Caleb's, not with fear, but with a warning. Do not take what I'm protecting. Caleb lowered himself slowly into the damp leaves, careful not to break the spell of stillness. Hey there, he whispered, voice raw from disuse. Easy, girl. I'm not here to hurt you. The puppy didn't growl. She simply remained where she was, her body a shield, her heart a fortress. Her fur was thick but dirty, with burrs tangled in her tail. She was thin, too thin for her age, but her frame suggested she'd grow into a strong adult someday. Her eyes, though, held an old sadness. Caleb had seen that look before. In the mirror, in the photographs he no longer displayed. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crushed peanut butter protein bar, the only thing he had with him. Breaking off a corner, he gently tossed it a few feet away. The pup didn't move, not even a twitch. Her attention was entirely on the rabbit. Caleb leaned back against a tree and exhaled. He would wait. A few minutes later, a soft crack of twigs signaled another presence. From between the trees, a small figure peered out half-hidden behind a young white pine. A little girl, no more than 9, with auburn curls tucked beneath a green knit beanie. She wore a too large jacket and rubber boots dotted with cartoon frogs. Her name was Lucy Montgomery, the granddaughter of Caleb's only neighbor, Edna. Lucy had barely spoken a word since her mother died the year prior from complications of lupus. Her anxiety manifested in silence, in trembling hands, and in wide, watchful eyes. She had a quiet way of moving as though afraid the world would crack if she stepped too loud. Caleb noticed her and gave a gentle nod. "She yours?" he asked, softly, nodding toward the puppy. Lucy shook her head, eyes still locked on the golden dog and the motionless rabbit. Then, without a word, she stepped closer, but only until the puppy looked up sharply. She froze. Caleb lifted his hand slightly. "She's guarding that rabbit like it's her kin." Still no response from Lucy, but her fingers curled into fists at her side. The puppy didn't seem afraid of Lucy, just wary the way a soldier scans the horizon for movement. After another minute, the girl retreated behind the tree again, silent as a ghost. Caleb sighed, rubbing his knuckles against his jaw. "All right," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "Let's do this slow." He retrieved a small cloth from his backpack, an old flannel he'd used as a makeshift sling once, and began inching toward the rabbit, not the pup. The golden retriever tensed, eyes locked, but she didn't growl or lunge. Caleb stopped. "You're not going to let me take her, huh?" he murmured. "What if I help you carry her?" Still no response from the dog. The rabbit stirred slightly, a weak tremble in its paw. The puppy's ears flicked. She leaned down gently, licked the rabbit's head, and turned her eyes back toward Caleb. Permission, or at least not denial. With slow precision, Caleb wrapped the rabbit in the flannel. The puppy stepped forward once, placing her paw next to his, watching every motion. The cut on her leg had reopened. A small trickle of blood stained the leaves. "We'll take care of both of you," Caleb promised. He didn't know why he said we. He hadn't used that word in 2 years. After a short walk back to the cabin, the pup curled up immediately next to the rabbit's makeshift bed, an old cardboard box lined with towels. Caleb cleaned the rabbit's wounds, checked its leg a clean break, and gave it water from a spoon. Meanwhile, the puppy didn't take her eyes off her charge, not even when Caleb opened a can of food. Only when Lucy appeared again, this time at the front step, did the pup move slightly. Aspen, Caleb decided. That would be her name. Gentle, strong, and golden like the trees she came from. "Do you want to come in?" Caleb asked Lucy. She didn't answer, but she stepped inside, slow and barefoot as if entering a church. She knelt beside Aspen, not speaking, just breathing. Aspen, for her part, laid her head down and sighed. Outside, the fog lifted slightly as the sun began to filter through the pines. In that cabin, for the first time in a very long time, something stirred. Not just survival, but something like trust. Chapter 2. The Nameless Protector. The next morning arrived, dressed in fog and gold. Sunlight pierced through the tall evergreens outside Caleb's cabin, spilling in long ribbons across the wooden floorboards. The scent of pine needles drifted in through the cracked window, mingling with the faint smell of old coffee grounds and cedar. The silence, once something sharp and unbearable, now held a softness that surprised Caleb as he stood at the kitchen sink washing out a metal bowl. Behind him, the sound of shallow breathing reminded him he was no longer alone. Aspen lay beside the makeshift bed of the injured rabbit, now nestled in a box lined with old flannel and dried hay Caleb had found in the shed. The pup's head rested on her front paws, one ear still flopped forward, her golden fur catching the light like polished wheat. Though her cut paw had been cleaned and bandaged, she still favored it, slightly shifting every so often to relieve pressure. Her eyes remained on the rabbit, unblinking and protective. She hadn't eaten, not a single bite. Caleb dried his hands, walked over and sat on the floor beside her. "You're really not going to eat until she does, huh?" he murmured. Aspen didn't respond, not with a bark or a growl, but she shifted slightly, pressing her body closer to the box. Caleb exhaled and reached out, placing the bowl of softened kibble near her. "Well, suit yourself." There was a light knock on the door. He turned surprised. Few people ever came by, and none uninvited. When he opened the door, Lucy stood there in her oversized hoodie and faded jeans, cheeks pink from the morning chill. In her gloved hands was a small bundle, clovers, dandelions, and one bright yellow buttercup. For her, she said quietly, nodding toward the rabbit. Caleb stepped aside and gestured her in. "Come on in, then." Lucy moved with care, as if afraid a wrong step would collapse the space around her. She approached the box, kneeled, and gently placed the flowers in the corner beside the rabbit. Aspen gave a low whimper. Not sad, just acknowledgement, and laid her head back down. For the next few minutes, the three of them simply sat. No words, no movement, just a shared stillness. Caleb, for once, didn't feel the need to fill the silence. It spoke well enough on its own. A knock again. This one firmer. Caleb raised an eyebrow and stood to answer it. On the porch stood a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a coat the color of storm clouds. She had silver-streaked hair tied back in a practical bun, sturdy hiking boots, and the posture of someone used to saying what needed to be said. Her name was Beth Carver, a local wildlife rehabilitator, and one of the few people in town who remembered Caleb from before the accident. "I heard from Edna that you found something that belongs to me," Beth said, without preamble, eyeing him up and down. Caleb stepped aside. "Depends what you mean by belongs." "Come in." Beth entered, scanning the cabin with the quick efficiency of a nurse. When she saw the rabbit in the box, her face softened. "Oh, poor thing. That's a swamp rabbit female. Probably got clipped by a coyote or a fox." "It was this pup that found her," Caleb said, nodding toward Aspen. "Wouldn't leave her side." Beth crouched next to the box, her tone switching to something softer as she examined the rabbit. "She's in shock. Broken leg, looks like. But she's stable." Aspen's tail gave a slow, uncertain wag, as if unsure whether to trust this new arrival. "And the dog?" Beth asked. "Found her with the rabbit, or maybe the rabbit found her. Hard to tell." Beth narrowed her eyes. "Golden retriever mix. Maybe 4 or 5 months. Malnourished, maybe dumped. You planning to keep her?" Caleb didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Aspen, then at Lucy, who now sat cross-legged beside the box, fingers brushing the rabbit's fur. "She hasn't left the rabbit since I brought them in," Caleb said finally. "She's not mine. But she's not anyone else's either." Beth gave a low hum. "You got a name for her, Aspen. Good name. Strong trees, those." Beth stood brushing dust from her knees. "I'll take the rabbit to my facility. She's got a fighting chance, but I can't promise anything." At her words, Aspen stood, wobbly, slow but determined. She limped toward the box, nudging it once with her nose. Beth frowned. "You think she understands?" "She does," Caleb said quietly. "And she won't let you take that rabbit without her knowing where it's going." Beth hesitated, then said, "Tell you what, I'll let her ride with me. If she gets too nervous, you come get her." Caleb nodded. "Deal." Before Beth left, Lucy stood and stepped forward, extending one of her clover flowers toward Aspen. The pup sniffed it, then gently licked Lucy's hand. Caleb saw the tiniest upturn at the corner of the girl's lips. Beth carried the box carefully to the back of her SUV, laying it inside a padded crate. Aspen followed, leaping awkwardly into the back seat beside it. As the engine started, she pressed her nose against the metal bars, watching the box like it was a heartbeat in the dark. Caleb stood on the porch watching the car disappear down the gravel road. The fog had lifted. The sun now spilled freely across the clearing, and somewhere behind him the kettle began to hiss. Later that day, as the sun dipped low, Lucy returned again, this time with a sketchbook. She didn't speak, just sat on the steps, drawing. Caleb poured 2 mugs of cocoa, handed one to her, and sat beside her in silence. He looked down once to see what she was drawing. It was Aspen curled around the rabbit. Below it, she had written in wobbly cursive, "Sometimes we protect what we love before we even know it." He smiled. Chapter 3. Winter comes to the heart. The first snow came early that year, catching the town of Blue Hollow off guard. By mid-November, frost clung like lace to the windows, and the whisper of wind through the trees had become a constant presence. Caleb's cabin, nestled among thick pines and sloping oaks, creaked and settled like an old ship enduring the shift in seasons with a kind of weary grace. Inside, the fire crackled softly, casting orange light across the walls, warming the floorboards and the hearts that had begun to gather beneath its roof. Aspen lay curled near the hearth, her golden coat now brushed clean and slightly fuller thanks to regular meals and careful grooming. Her paw, once wrapped in makeshift bandages, was almost healed, though she still limped slightly. Yet even with the limp, her spirit had begun to re-emerge, tail wagging when Caleb came near, ears lifting at the sound of the kettle, whistling eyes darting to the door when Lucy's boots crunched on the gravel outside. It had been nearly 2 weeks since Clover the rabbit had been taken to Beth Carver's Wildlife Center. Every day since Aspen would nudge the back door at dawn, waiting, hoping, perhaps, listening. Caleb had begun to worry, not about Aspen's health, but her heart. She had become a protector without a charge, a sentry with no one to guard. And though her body healed, there was a quiet sorrow to her that hadn't lifted. That morning, Caleb stood by the window holding a chipped mug of black coffee, watching the snow begin to fall in earnest. He glanced over at Aspen and then down to the couch where Lucy had fallen asleep during one of their now regular visits. She'd been coming more often, staying longer, still mostly silent, but slowly more present. Sometimes she brought her sketchbook. Sometimes she brought stories written in pencil on folded notebook paper, always about animals, always with happy endings. Today, she had brought nothing, just herself. Her eyes blinked open as the fire popped. "You're up," Caleb said gently. Lucy nodded, rubbing her eyes with the sleeves of her coat. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but steady. "Do you think she misses the rabbit I do?" Caleb replied. "I think she's still waiting." Lucy sat up, pulling her knees to her chest. "I do that sometimes," she said. "Wait for someone who's not coming." Caleb didn't press. He just sat beside her, the silence filling with understanding. Later that afternoon, a rusted red pickup pulled into the clearing. Caleb recognized the truck immediately. It was Beth's. As the engine cut, Aspen jumped to her feet, ears alert, tail straight. Her body trembled slightly, but not from fear. Caleb opened the door and stepped onto the porch, his breath puffing in white clouds. Beth stepped out, wearing her thick winter coat, a scarf wound around her neck. Her face was pinched from the cold, but her eyes were bright. "She made it," she said simply, and opened the passenger door. Nestled in a soft carrier was Clover. The rabbit's leg was splinted with a small padded brace, her eyes alert, her ears twitching. She looked thinner, but stronger. Aspen let out a low, hopeful whimper and stepped forward, tail wagging in careful arcs. Beth carried the carrier inside, setting it beside the hearth. Aspen immediately lay down beside it, nose pressed gently to the mesh. "She's not out of the woods," Beth said, taking off her gloves. "But she's stronger than most we see." "She had help," Caleb said, glancing down at Aspen. Beth chuckled. That she did, as evening settled and snow coated the windows like icing. Lucy sat beside the fire once more, now reading one of her stories aloud. Her voice wavered at first, but steadied as she went. Aspen lay curled against the carrier ears, twitching at each page turn. Clover, resting inside, blinked slowly, her small chest rising and falling with peaceful rhythm. That night, after Beth had left and Lucy had gone home, Caleb sat alone at the dining table, journal open before him. He hadn't written in months. Not since the last time he tried to pen a letter to his wife and tore it up before finishing the second line. But tonight he wrote. Not about grief, not even about healing. He wrote about Aspen, and about how sometimes love doesn't arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it comes in the shape of a dog who limps and refuses to leave the side of the broken. Chapter 4. When a Life Slips Away. The wind came sharp that morning, carving through the trees with a whistle that made the window panes shudder. A heavy gray hung in the sky, not quite snow, but too thick to be mist. Caleb stood outside, stacking firewood near the shed gloves, stiff with frost, breath steaming in the air. He paused between loads, glancing toward the cabin where the fire inside still glowed faintly behind the curtains. His body ached from the cold, but it was a good ache, one that reminded him he was doing something that mattered. Inside, Aspen lay in her usual place beside Clover's carrier, her head resting on her front paws, her eyes tracing every tiny movement the rabbit made. Clover had been back for 4 days. At first, she seemed stronger, alert, even curious, but then her energy began to dip. The limp in her leg had returned with more strain, and yesterday she hadn't touched the carrot slices Lucy offered her. Lucy now sat cross-legged on the floor, gently stroking Aspen's fur, while glancing nervously at the rabbit's still form. She wore a pale purple hoodie with stars drawn across the sleeves, and her blonde curls were tied in a loose braid. Though she rarely spoke more than a few words at a time, her silence today was different. It wasn't fear. It was dread. Beth had stopped by the day before, concern etched deep across her brow. "She's tired," she said softly after examining Clover. "Sometimes the body just gives up, even when the heart wants to stay." Aspen hadn't moved from her post since. Now, as the cabin warmed and the snow began to fall in fat, lazy flakes, Clover's chest barely rose beneath the flannel. Caleb stepped inside, brushing snow from his shoulders, and noticed the change instantly. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was too complete. "She's not moving," Lucy whispered. Caleb knelt beside the box, watching. A minute passed. Another. Then he nodded once and placed a hand on Lucy's shoulder. Aspen rose slowly and limped toward the box. She sniffed once, then laid her chin on the edge, eyes open but dim, as if understanding in full what had happened. Caleb reached down to pet her, but she didn't lean into the touch. She stayed still, utterly still, as though the world had shifted and she had chosen to be its anchor. Clover had passed. There was no fanfare, no sudden collapse, just a stillness that grew too wide. That afternoon, the three of them walked into the woods behind the cabin. Caleb carried a small wooden box made from pine slats and lined with dry leaves. Lucy held a small candle in a jar. Aspen trotted slowly behind them, her gait heavy but determined. They stopped in a small clearing near the base of an old elm, its bark etched with years of lightning scars. Caleb dug the earth with a hand spade while Lucy watched in silence. The cold soil gave way with effort, and once the grave was made, they laid Clover to rest beneath the tree's roots. "I don't know what to say," Lucy whispered. "You don't have to," Caleb said, voice low. "Sometimes the words come later." Lucy placed the jar beside the box. Inside it, the candle flickered. Aspen stepped forward and laid a paw over the edge of the grave just for a moment, then stepped back. They stood together for several minutes. Then the snow began again, gentle quiet, the kind that doesn't sting. Back at the cabin, Aspen lay down by the hearth without prompting. She didn't whimper or pace. She simply curled in as though the final vigil had ended. Lucy took her sketchbook and began to draw. She didn't show it to anyone, but she glanced at Aspen every few minutes as if making sure she was capturing her exactly as she was, in that moment, solid, brave, quietly grieving. Later that evening, a knock came at the door. Caleb opened it to find Tom Harlan, a stocky man in his early 50s with thick eyebrows, a scruffy gray beard, and the unmistakable smell of tobacco and winter air. Tom ran the local feed store and had known Caleb's family before the tragedy. He was the sort of man who didn't say much unless it mattered, and when he did, it came out like gravel. "Heard about the rabbit," Tom said, holding out a tin box. "My wife made these. Figured the kid and the dog could use a treat." Caleb took the tin and nodded. "Thanks, Tom." Tom leaned in slightly, peering past the door. "That the same dog Edna said wouldn't eat unless the rabbit did. That's her." Tom gave a grunt. "Good one, that pup. Not many like her." He paused, then reached into his coat and pulled out a hand-carved wooden tag, slightly misshapen. "Not much, but I made it for the grave. If it's not too late." Caleb took the tag. The name Clover had been burned into the wood along with a tiny leaf beside it. "It's perfect," Tom nodded once and turned to leave without another word. The night settled quiet again, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire and the rustle of Lucy's pencil on paper. Caleb stood by the window watching snow gather on the porch railing. Aspen slept nearby, twitching once in her dreams. He thought of loss, of how it comes again and again like seasons, and how sometimes you don't heal by forgetting, you heal by remembering with less pain, and sometimes you heal because something smaller, braver, softer than you stayed through it all. Chapter 5. Where Trust Begins. 3 weeks had passed since Clover's burial, and though the frost still clung to the edges of the woods each morning, there was something new in the air, something softer, the kind of quiet that didn't ache. Caleb noticed it first in Aspen, who no longer lay by the empty carrier, but instead claimed the front porch as her throne. She'd grown since they first found her, her coat now full and glossy, her stride stronger, though she still bore a subtle limp that added character more than fragility. She spent her mornings sniffing frost-bitten leaves and her afternoons chasing sunlight as it moved across the wooden floor inside the cabin. It was in those same weeks that Lucy began arriving not just after school, but on Saturdays, then Sundays too. Her grandmother Edna had given Caleb a knowing smile the last time she dropped her off, saying, "She talks about that dog more than anything else." Said Aspen understands her better than most people. Lucy now brought books, stories, her sketchbook, and the first hints of joy that shimmered behind her once guarded eyes. That morning, Lucy sat on the porch steps reading a dog-eared copy of Charlotte's Web. Aspen curled at her side, nose twitching with every breeze. The warmth between them was easy natural. Caleb watched from the kitchen window while scrambling eggs, noting how Lucy now leaned into moments instead of away from them. Later that afternoon he drove into town with Lucy and Aspen riding beside him in the old truck. They needed supplies, dog food, firewood, a new kettle. Aspen had claimed her spot in the passenger seat, nose out the window, tail tapping with each turn. Lucy, in her woolen cap and red scarf, sat in the back seat quietly humming a song from memory. The feed store Harlan's smelled of hay and cracked corn. The aisles were narrow shelves stacked high with seed tools and pet supplies. Tom Harlan was behind the counter wearing a plaid jacket and his usual no-nonsense expression. His beard was shorter today and a pencil tucked behind one ear. When he saw Aspen enter with Caleb and Lucy, he nodded once. "She's filled out nice," he said. "Shiny coat. Walks proud." "She's earned it," Caleb replied, grabbing a bag of feed. "And she's got a fan club now." Tom's eyes twinkled briefly at Lucy. "You keeping an eye on this one?" Lucy smiled just a little, then nodded. A soft commotion at the door caught everyone's attention. A woman stepped in mid-30s, tall and lean, with a long brown coat and a cane in one hand. Her eyes were a piercing shade of gray framed by short dark hair tucked beneath a knitted beanie. There was a faint scar running along her left cheek, subtle but sharp as though left by glass or metal. Her name was Rachel McKinney, a former firefighter who had retired early after an injury during a rescue 3 years ago. She had moved to the outskirts of Blue Hollow recently and lived alone with a one-eyed cat named Leonard. Rachel moved with precision, her limp noticeable but steady, her expression reserved. She approached the counter slowly. "Tom, you still got that insulated doghouse out back?" "Still there." "You got a dog now?" he asked. "Not yet," she replied, "but the barn's got company." Caleb watched her with quiet interest. Rachel gave a small nod toward Aspen. "That's a good dog," she said simply. "She's better than I deserve," Caleb replied, half smiling. Rachel gave the faintest smile, but her eyes lingered on Aspen a second longer than necessary. On the drive home, Lucy asked about the woman. Caleb explained what little he knew. Rachel had been injured pulling a child from a burning apartment. The child survived, but the fire left Rachel with damage to her hip and lung. She had since chosen a life of solitude, but she was known for walking the woods with a backpack full of books and food for strays. That night, back at the cabin, Aspen settled beside the fire, her paw draped over a new plush toy Lucy had brought her, a small fabric fox with a crooked ear. Caleb poured 2 mugs of hot chocolate and handed one to Lucy, who was busy drawing Aspen's portrait. It wasn't perfect, but the lines were confident. "You've gotten better," he said. "I've been practicing," she whispered, cheeks warm. Outside, the snow began again, not heavy but gentle, a quiet reminder of the season's shift. After Lucy left that evening, Caleb stood by the front door watching the snow fall. Aspen joined him, sitting quietly, gaze fixed beyond the porch. There was peace there, something earned, not given. Caleb reached down, scratched behind her ear. "You stayed," he murmured, "even after it hurt." Aspen didn't move, but her tail tapped once, and that was enough. Where the broken stay brave. Not every rescue ends with ribbons or fireworks. Sometimes it ends with a quiet breath beside a fireplace, a paw resting gently over a memory, and a heart that chooses to stay open despite everything. Aspen didn't just find a home. She helped build one. For Caleb, for Lucy, for those of us who've ever lost something and wondered if healing would ever come. Because in real life, pain doesn't knock first. It enters uninvited. But so does love when we least expect it. Maybe you've been like Caleb, carrying silence that no one sees. Maybe you're like Lucy, still finding your voice through the ones who listen without judgment. Or maybe like Aspen, you've been small and scarred, yet still brave enough to protect something broken. If this story touched a corner of your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment with amen if you believe that healing is possible even after the hardest winters. And if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the quiet power of staying, then subscribe to our channel for more stories that light the way. May God bless you wherever you are, and may the ones you love always find their way home.